Now, I believe that dinosaurs and people lived at the same time.
The fact that we know that pterodactyls did exist, that's cool.
Right.
It would be way cooler is if they existed with people.
Right.
I mean, if there was any credibility to the idea of dragons being real, there'd be some scientific evidence. Well, believe it or not, we have found physical evidence of every one of these dragons. There are hundreds of dragon legends from around the world and all throughout recorded history. Legends are rooted in reality. What if dragon legends were actually based on something real? I was in Plymouth with my family not too long ago, and I got to see Plymouth Rock. It was smaller than I expected, but still cool. And we found a little gift shop right near Plymouth Rock. And inside of that gift shop, I found this little book called Sea Serpents of Coastal New England. And it was part of the New England Folklore series, is what they called it. But none of the accounts in this little book read like fiction. They're all written like eyewitness accounts of things that actually happened with original published dates and times and everything. And some of the stories sound kind of like maybe a giant eel or a sea snake, but there are a couple that sound like something else. So let's read a couple of these. I used to laugh when they talked about sea serpents, but when I saw this one, I was convinced. He was at least 60 feet long, and he had fins 5 to 6 feet high out of the water. I saw him for about 5 minutes while I was hauling. And then this story. They were surprised when a large animal thrust its turtle-shaped head about 6 to 8 feet out of the water, remaining 5 to 10 seconds, and then went down. This continued for a matter of 2 hours, which it was chased and shot at with a Ballard rifle. The distance at which it was observed ranged from 40 to 160 yards. The color was black, whitish beneath. No scales were noted. The diameter of the neck was about 1.5 feet, while at the water it seemed to broaden with the appearance of flippers. So that's that account. He said it happened in 1939. You might know some people who were alive in 1939. That's crazy. What do we make of this, right? One of my favorite movies is How to Train a Dragon. And the animated series was so successful that they've already made a live-action remake. The grand total of franchise box office earnings for How to Train a Dragon is $2.2 billion, not counting merchandise sales. So very popular, right? So popular that they're now opening the Isle of Berk at Universal Orlando. So you can go and see dragons and see the island of Berk. But our culture today is fascinated by dragons, right? We're obsessed with them. They're mysterious, intriguing, dangerous, ginormous. They capture our imagination like few creatures can. They're incorporated into many of our favorite stories. Maybe one of your favorite stories is up there. And it's not just modern stories the dragons are part of. Ancient dragon legends keep coming up too. Joe Rogan is an infamous podcaster, and he went viral on an episode where he talked about dragons. And here's what he said.
The fact that we know that pterodactyls did exist, that's cool.
Right.
It would be way cooler as if they existed with people.
Right, 2,000 years ago.
Why is that? But why is that so much cooler to us?
I don't know.
Shortly thereafter, he updated his ex-Twitter profile to say dragon believer. Later on, he clarified that in a follow-up episode where he said this.
My position is it's probably crocodiles or some big Komodo dragon or some big lizard that did kill people.
Touched one.
And so people fought them with swords. And they came back with a story, and then the artist drew it.
All right, so his claim is that they were crocodiles or giant lizards or something like that. Well, how big do some of those animals get? Well, let's look at some of those animals life size on the screen. So this is a Komodo dragon. This is the largest lizard in the world, named after a dragon, ironically. This is how big crocodiles can get today, the largest crocodile, about 20 feet long. But if we look at extinct animals, they got even bigger. This is Megalania, the largest monitor lizard ever found. And this is Sarcosuchus, a crocodile that got 30 feet long. And if you look at snakes, they get pretty large too. So today, the record snake is a reticulated python at around 32, 33 feet long. But extinct snakes got even bigger. This is Titanoboa, 49 feet long. I hope you don't find that in your backyard. So I think these might explain some of the dragon legends we have. But Joe Rogan asks an important question.
Now, are there any stories of dragons, like written, like in the times of people that they actually had the written word, or is it just depictions?
I don't know. Not my field.
Not my field. Have you ever thought, wow, there's a lot that I don't know, right? We think we know a lot. There's so much information we don't know. Joe Rogan asked a really good question, though. Are there written accounts of dragons? Turns out there are. There are hundreds of dragon legends from around the world and all throughout recorded history. People use this word dragon and variations of it. And many of them have similar characteristics and descriptions. What are the chances of that happening by accident? For example, the Chinese zodiac. Now, I'm not a proponent of astrology, but it's really interesting that the Chinese zodiac has 11 animals that are real, and then the 12th one is a dragon. Isn't that crazy? It's almost like those people that made this believed that that animal was just as real as the other 11. Why would they use one mythological beast? And we know it wasn't based on a giant snake because a snake is also in the zodiac. There are other ancient dragon legends too. Way back in 340 BC, Aristotle talked about dragons as if they were real creatures being observed. He said, "The dragon, when it eats fruit, swallows endive juice. It has been seen in the act." Again, this isn't like telling a fairy tale. It's like somebody observed this. Even as recent as 1902, the idea of dragons and sea serpents was seen as credible. Encyclopedia Britannica. Anybody remember Encyclopedia? Anybody read one of those? The 1902 edition, the entry for dragon, said this: "There is still a residuum sufficient to prevent modern zoologists from denying the possibility that some such creature may after all exist." So even as early as 1902, in a reputable publication, they were saying, yeah, it's possible, maybe it existed. But by 1910, the entry had been changed to just say dragons are all myths. So it's only in the past 100 years or so that that idea has been prominent. So as I was saying, this is Draco, the dragon. You need to go sit down. Mo, it's not your turn yet. Yes, go sit down. Go back. Draco the dragon, ladies and gentlemen. Give him a hand. He gets excited when I talk about his friends. Now, I need you guys to do me a favor. I need you to help me out and keep an eye on him, because he can cause trouble sometimes, okay? So if he starts doing something, you need to tell me. Legends are rooted in reality. What if dragon legends were actually based on something real? Let's talk about dodo birds for a minute.
There goes our last female.
You guys have probably seen and heard of dodo birds before. Dodo birds, for a long time, people didn't believe that the dodo bird existed. They thought it was just a legend. For about 100 years, people thought that the dodo bird was a myth until 1800, when a skeleton was discovered. Because they went extinct, people thought they were a myth, but they discovered a skeleton, and they discovered that the legend was true. Legends are rooted in reality. It was assumed to be a myth for over 150 years. Now check this out. Just like the dodo bird, all of these creatures were at one time thought to be mythological legends. And then decades or even centuries later, they were found and scientifically documented. Most of these animals were confirmed to be real only in the last 100 to 200 years. It's very recent. Now you might say, that doesn't happen anymore, does it? Actually, it does. This is the Asian antelope. It's named a Saola. And they didn't actually find one alive until 1996. They went extinct a few years later, sadly. But it was another legend that was rooted in reality. The giant squid, this huge creature. It was one of my favorites as a kid. I love the giant squid. It's very fascinating. But they didn't get live video footage of a giant squid until 2012 off the coast of Japan. And for the first time in U.S. waters in 2019. So there's so much we don't know. But as humans, we get arrogant, don't we? We think we know a lot. We think we have the world all figured out. But there's so much we don't know. Now this shows the estimated size of the biggest squid we've ever measured, around 43 feet long. But there were probably even bigger ones. Maybe that's what sailors call the kraken. Something like that. So these creatures had eyewitness sightings and even some written records, but they were assumed to be myths for centuries until recently confirmed by scientists. What if, thought experiment here, what if one of these creatures went extinct before we found them? They would stay a myth, wouldn't they? Giant pandas or manatees or some of these others might have easily been classified as a myth, and we would have never known differently. Dozens of species go extinct every decade. How many creatures have gone extinct before today and were never discovered as from science? We have thousands of years of eyewitness testimonies and written records talking about dragons as real creatures from all over the world. Dragons weren't considered mythological creatures until the 1900s. Did you know that dragons were mentioned in the Bible? Raise your hand if you knew that dragons were mentioned in the Bible. Now, some of these mentions appear to be symbolic, but some appear to refer to real creatures. We'll talk more about dragons in the Bible and some other dragon accounts in a few minutes. Now, many of the dragon legends, as I said, use similar language to describe these creatures. Land dragons, sea dragons, winged dragons, reptilian with scales, giant teeth, flaring nostrils, big spikes and horns, frills and spines. In a couple of minutes, we're going to dive into a few of these specifically that we think have eyewitness accounts of some of these dragons. Now, you might be thinking, okay, dragons being real, that still sounds pretty far-fetched, doesn't it? I mean, if there was any credibility to the idea of dragons being real, there'd be some scientific evidence, like bones or remains or something. Well, believe it or not, we have found physical evidence of every one of these dragons that you see on the screen here. We found bones of every one of these dragons. Let me show you what I mean. Now, we have modern words for these animals. We call them dinosaurs or pterosaurs, pterodactyls, plesiosaurs, mosasaurs. But the word dinosaur wasn't invented until the 1800s. All of these bones of real creatures that have been found, when you put flesh on these bones, they looked a lot like what we expect dragons to look like, don't they? In fact, scientists even recognize that dinosaurs look like dragons. They look so much like dragons that the scientists often include the word dragon in dinosaur names. So here's a list of a couple dozen dinosaur names that have the word dragon in them. Words like Draco, Darko, Drakon, Asdar, Long, and others that are root word that means dragon in other languages. Let's look at one of those dinosaur names. This one is named Draco Rex. It was named after a skull found in Iowa in 2006. Look at that skull. Very dragon looking, isn't it? Very dragon-like with all the horns and spines. And if you add flesh to it, it looks a lot like a dragon. Definitely dragon-like, isn't it? Now, the name means Dragon King of Hogwarts. It's named after the Harry Potter series. And Dracorex is believed by many to be a juvenile Pachycephalosaurus. This is a guy with a dome-shaped head, and they may have banged their heads together like bighorn sheep do today. It was about 15 feet long. It's actually featured in one of the older Jurassic Park movies. Now check this out. This is a relief etching that was found in a 14th century church in the country of Georgia. It's very dinosaur-like, don't you think? Maybe this represents two dinosaurs butting their heads together. The best explanation that I've seen other researchers have for it, other than a dragon, is a salamander. Doesn't look much like a salamander to me. Now, some of you might be thinking, hold on. Dragon legends can't be from dinosaurs because dinosaurs and people didn't live together.
Dinosaurs and man, two species separated by 65 million years of evolution, have just been suddenly thrown back into the mix together.
How many of you have heard the idea that dinosaurs lived millions of years ago? Right? We've all heard that idea. It's even in kids' books. Kids can tell you this. You can even watch kids' television shows like Dinosaur Train.
I bet we hiked into the Jurassic layer, which is millions of years older than the Cretaceous layer back up there where we started.
So before we dive into any more of these dragon legends, I want to answer the question of millions of years and address that. But let's start with this question. How long would a species have to be extinct or be missing before you know that it's completely extinct? This furry little guy is a Cuban solenodon. And he was discovered in 1861, presumed to be extinct by 1890, and then later on discovered in 1974 to still be alive. And you might say, that's totally different. That was only like 84 years, right, that they thought he was extinct. Dinosaurs have been extinct for millions of years, you might say. Well, that's what's really interesting about solenodons. They're actually called living fossils. And they're called that because we've found fossils of these solenodons that are said to have lived 30 million years ago. And this is just one example of a living fossil. Fossils of all of these animals on the screen have been found in the same rock layers as dinosaur bones, and they're also alive today. Now, some of these fossils are the same species of animals alive today. Others are unique species but look remarkably similar to animals alive today. So this idea of an age of reptiles is looking less and less accurate. Sometimes we think we know a lot about the past, but if you watch the news and pay attention to science headlines, you'll see something like, "This discovery changes everything." And you'll see that almost every week. Something is always coming out and changing the storyline. So we don't often know as much as we think we know. A great example of a living fossil is coelacanth, which is a fish. And fossils of this fish were discovered in the 1800s, and a live one was caught in 1938. 1938, supposedly 60 million years after it went extinct. And there were no fossils in between today and those layers. Now, living coelacanths can get to be about 7 feet long, but extinct ones, they could grow to be about 16 feet long. That's a giant fish. These are only a few of the many examples of living fossils. And all of these animals lived with dinosaurs, and many, like the coelacanth, didn't leave any fossil evidence in more recent rock layers. So, how can scientists know for sure which animals actually survived? There's so much we don't know about the past. Isn't it possible that dinosaurs lived longer than most people think? These animals did. Now, I believe that dinosaurs and people lived at the same time. And it's not just me. There are a large number of PhD scientists that believe this too. Some of them work here at Answers in Genesis. I want to share some of the things that I've learned from them with you. Living fossils are the first of 5 big reasons why that convinced me that dinosaurs and people lived at the same time. Just because something is found in different rock layers doesn't mean that animal can't be alive today. Number 2 is carbon dating. And this might surprise you. You might say carbon dating proves old ages, doesn't it? Actually, carbon dating only dates things up to 50 to 80,000 years old. Anything older than that, and the radiocarbon levels are too low to be detected. So most scientists don't date dinosaur fossils because they assume they won't detect any radiocarbons. But guess what happens when you do date a dinosaur fossil? You find radiocarbon. They're dated to only thousands of years old, not millions. This is a quote from Dr. Andrew Snelling, a geologist. He says, "The scientific literature reported carbon-14 in 70 samples that came from fossils, coal, oil, natural gas, and marble, supposedly spanning more than 500 million years, all containing radiocarbon. Diamonds, supposedly 1 to 3 billion years old, similarly yielded radiocarbon." These things are not as old as people think they are. Carbon dating confirms that dinosaurs didn't live millions of years ago. Even other radiometric dating methods, when used on rocks of known ages, show much older dates than they should. So it's not a very reliable resource. Number 3, dinosaur fossils have been found with soft tissues inside of them. Most scientists didn't believe this at first, but there's now overwhelming evidence. There are 130 peer-reviewed research papers describing original proteins and biomolecules inside dinosaur bones. A creation scientist from ICR, Institute for Creation Research, named Dr. Bryan Thomas, he actually did a whole bunch of study on this. He sequenced the proteins from these dinosaur bones and found that they were original collagen fibers from the dinosaur bones. They weren't like washed in or something like that. It's not possible for tissues like this to last millions of years. Evolutionists don't have an adequate explanation for this. Soft tissue in dinosaur bones confirms that dinosaurs did not live millions of years ago. Number 4 is fossil graveyards. And a great example of this is Dinosaur National Monument in Utah. There's 210,000 acres with fossils embedded all over. And in the Quarry Exhibit Hall alone, there's over 1,500 fossils visible on the surface from at least 11 different species of dinosaurs. And look at all these bones. They're just all jumbled together. It's hard to even tell what's connected to what. Another example of a mass burial is this guy. This is a Pachyrhinosaurus. He was found in Alberta, Canada. There were over 8,000 bones of Pachyrhinosaurus. They're in the same family as Triceratops. Hundreds of individuals, all buried rapidly together by what scientists say was a flood, interestingly enough. There are hundreds of examples from around the world where fossils of dinosaurs and other animals show evidence of rapid burial. Very different from the story of millions of years and slow fossilization. Turns out fossils form very quickly under the right conditions. Most of these examples show explicit evidence of water. Floods, mudslides, marine creatures. Now, what event in biblical history would make sense of rapid burial of fossils like this? Got any ideas? Noah's flood. The flood of Noah's day. The worldwide flood of Noah's day. All right. So those are my 4 favorite scientific reasons why I believe dinosaurs and humans live together. But I said I was going to share 5 reasons. The 5th reason is the biggest one. It's the best evidence that dinosaurs lived with people. Are you ready? The biggest reason is actually not from science. See, science textbooks, like we just talked about, they change all the time. People make mistakes because there's so much we don't know. Instead of trusting man's word, who doesn't know everything, hasn't always been there, I'd rather trust the words of someone who's always been there, who knows everything, and who never lies. Let's look at God's word. John 1:3 says, "All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made." Genesis 1:25 says, "And God made the beasts of the earth according to their kind, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind, and God saw that it was good." So, according to the Bible, God made dinosaurs and other land animals he created on day 6, the same day as Adam and Eve. So the idea of millions of years, it didn't come from the Bible. It was an idea that man created and tried to insert into the Bible. Now, if I take man's ideas and force them into the Bible, that's kind of that arrogance we were talking about, isn't it? It's elevating my words, man's words, above God's words. Let's talk about that, because some people say, yeah, but couldn't God use millions of years to create? Well, there's multiple problems with that. So let's just talk about 2 of them. The way people try to add millions of years to the Bible is in the days of creation, because all the rest of the history you can back up pretty well. But the days of creation is where they try to stick it in. They try to make the days longer. They try to insert gaps between them. But the days of creation, at the end of the creation week, God said everything he had made was very good because there was no sin and death yet, right? So if millions of years of rock layers and fossils happened before sin, how could we explain fossils like this? This is a fossil of a velociraptor attacking a protoceratops. The raptor's sickle claws look like they're digging into the protoceratops' neck. The proto has the raptor's arm in its mouth. Did God call bloodshed and violence like this very good? This also had to be buried very quickly to be preserved like this. It's an amazing preservation. Here's a fossil of thorns. They were found in the Carboniferous layers of rock, and that's earlier in the rock layers than when dinosaurs are found. But according to God's word, thorns and thistles didn't exist until after Adam and Eve sinned. Here's a fossil of a dinosaur leg bone. It is a Centrosaurus, which is in the same family as Triceratops. And you can see that yellow area on the bone. That's cancer. Scientists can study these bones at a molecular level, and they can determine what's happening there. And this dinosaur had cancer. Did God call cancer very good? There's many fossils like this that were buried. If they were buried before Adam and Eve sinned, that creates some serious theological issues. What kind of God would call these things very good? Let's look at the second major problem about adding millions of years to the Bible. Let's read Matthew 19:4. He answered, talking about Jesus, "Have you not read, he who created them from the beginning made them male and female?" Now, evolutionists teach that man has only existed for the last 0.4% of history. So man's way over here in the 0.4% of history, and they teach that there's millions of years of history that came before us, right? Well, Jesus said God made man from the beginning. It brings into question the character of God. It undermines Jesus' very words. Was Jesus lying when he said he made man from the beginning? When you start with the Bible, explaining the world, and even explaining things like dragons, makes much more sense. Let's talk about that. The Bible's history about dinosaurs and dragons can be summarized this way. First, they were formed. Dinosaurs were created during creation week on day 6, the same day as man. During that time, they were fearless because God made everything very good. There was no death, animals didn't eat each other, and that's why we show peaceful dinosaurs in the Garden of Eden at the Creation Museum. They're not killing each other, they're not violent, they're eating plants. Then, man sinned, so they were fallen. Thorns and thistles appeared, dinosaurs became more ferocious, cancer and death entered the world, like we talked about earlier. And then there was a flood. The flood of Noah resulted in billions of dead things buried in rock layers, laid down by water all over the earth. And most of the dinosaurs were buried in that flood, and that's why we find their fossils today. But 2 of each kind of dinosaur boarded Noah's Ark because they were air-breathing land animals. Now you might think, no way, we've all seen Jurassic Park, right? There's no way this guy was on Noah's Ark. I mean, a ferocious T-Rex would eat everything on the Ark, right? Well, Tyrannosaurus and other dinosaurs, they were large when they were adults and as they grew, but even this big guy started as an egg that was about 2 feet long. God wouldn't have brought Noah the big old dinosaurs. He would have brought young ones, like this guy. That's a juvenile T-Rex. And if you go to the Ark Encounter, how many of you have been to the Ark Encounter? Or planning on going? Anybody planning on going? Awesome. If you go there, this guy is in a cage on the Ark. Much more manageable size, right? Wouldn't be as ferocious. And much more likely to be able to reproduce after the flood. So, there was the flood. And then, dinosaurs and dragons, they faded from memory. They probably didn't survive as well as some other animals, obviously. Maybe from the different climate after the flood. Maybe because different foods were available. Or maybe humans killing them off. What are a lot of the dragon legends about? They're about people killing dragons. So they could have easily become extinct that way as well. As these animals became more and more rare, they became more legendary. And that's why we find artwork like this from the Middle Ages. There were legends of these dragons and maybe some sightings, and people got to see them. Then they were found. These fossils from the flood were found, and in 1841, the word dinosaur was coined by Sir Richard Owen. And it wasn't until that time. Draco, don't burn up my slides. You guys are supposed to help me. You're supposed to warn me about Draco. Okay, all right. So, I guess he wants us to talk about him. So we're going to talk about Draco now. You see, Draco is loosely based on some of this artwork from the Middle Ages. And this is one of the big mysteries about dragons. And that is, where did the idea of a 4-legged dragon with 2 wings come from? Some researchers even use that to undermine the idea that dragons were real. They say, we don't find fossils of that. We haven't found a dinosaur or a pterosaur with 4 legs and 2 wings. And so Draco is going to help us here to solve that mystery. And when I started looking into this and digging into these old drawings and paintings, I saw some of these drawings and paintings, and I thought to myself, those wings were way too small to carry one of these dragons. They weren't big enough for actual flight. And then I looked a little closer, and where is that wing coming from on the body? It looks like it's kind of coming from the armpit. It's not like the top of the back or anything like that we would expect. So I was really confused by that. What's going on? And then I remembered something. Now, you guys have probably all seen pterosaurs or pterodactyls like this guy. This is Rhamphorhynchus. And when pterosaurs were first discovered, scientists were trying to figure out how they flew, how they walked, all these different things, because they're very, very crazy-looking animals. At first, they thought they walked out with their wings kind of sprawled out, like in this picture. This picture is actually from an old poster in my office. I got the poster when I was a kid, back in the 90s. I was a dinosaur-obsessed kid. Who am I joking? I'm still a dinosaur-obsessed kid. I never really got through that. But a funny story, actually. Before I got married, I decorated my apartment with all my dinosaur toys and posters like this one. And then I got married and brought my wife back to our apartment, and she said, "Oh no, these dinosaurs are going to work with you." Thankfully, she's very nice, and she let me keep one of them at home. But the rest of them are in my office with this poster. But paleontologists and scientists, they thought maybe these animals walked like bats, right? Bats don't walk very well. They're kind of like sprawled out with their wings, not very efficient walkers. But then they discovered some footprints of pterosaurs. And so recently, they've updated that research, and it turns out these animals could walk and even run pretty well on all 4 legs. Then, several fossils show that the wing actually folds up really close next to the arm. And in some species, it may have even tucked behind the arm. And if you look at some of these other fossils, you can see that their wing is made of a giant finger that kind of extends out for half the wing. And that finger is pretty stiff when the wing is open, as you would expect, because it needs to support the flight. But when the wing is closed, it becomes more flexible, it seems. And you can see it even looks like it bends backward in some of these fossils. So if we bend the wing slightly, what is this starting to look like? Then we add some soft tissue. We We don't know exactly what they had, if they had a lot of scales or frills or anything like that. It's starting to look more and more like a dragon. Draco here is actually based on a pterosaur in the same family as Rhamphorhynchus called Harpactognathus. And the front legs and the wings are actually the same structure. It just opens it when it needs to fly. And then when it closes it, the wing tucks back behind the arm. And it looks like they have wings coming out of their back. When the wings fold, they look very similar to some of these ancient drawings and paintings. This is brand new research that takes the latest fossil evidence combined with some of these dragon legends to give a more complete picture of how these animals may have lived. Now, Rhamphorhynchoids, like Rhamphorhynchus and Harpactognathus, they're actually quite a bit smaller. So, sorry, Draco, you're not quite as big and scary. Although, even at this size, he probably had about an 11-foot wingspan, which is the same size as an Andean condor, one of the largest flying birds today. I would not want to mess with a dragon that size. That's still pretty large. Some pterosaurs grow even larger. This is the famous Pteranodon, very large, and the largest pterosaur was Quetzalcoatlus, and it looks like a giant giraffe dragon or something. It's kind of crazy. Now, Draco helped us with some of the Middle-aged dragon legends, but maybe he can help us explain some of the more ancient dragon legends as well. So this is a quote from Herodotus, a respected historian from around 400 BC. And he wrote about winged serpents. And he said, "I saw bones of serpents and spines in quantity so great that it is impossible to make report of the number. At the beginning of spring, winged serpents from Arabia that fly towards Egypt." So what's he talking about there? We don't find fossils of that either. We don't find fossils of a snake with wings. What does that mean? Well, these pterosaurs had long tails, some of them. And so when the wings were open, if you just saw one in the sky with a long tail, it may have looked like a flying serpent. So it might explain that too. This is a really crazy recent example of this. The Tombstone Epitaph newspaper in Arizona printed the following report in 1809. A strange monster discovered and killed in the Huachuca Desert. A winged monster resembling a huge alligator with an extremely elongated tail and immense pair of wings was found in the desert between Whetstone and Huachuca Mountains last Sunday by two ranchers who were returning home. The two men, who were on horseback and armed with Winchester rifles, pursued the monster and succeeded in getting near enough to open fire with their rifles, wounding it. The monster had only 2 feet. The head, as near as they could judge, was about 8 feet long, the jaws being thickly set with strong, sharp teeth. Its eyes were as large as dinner plates and protruded about halfway from the head. The total length from tip to tip was about 160 feet. The wings were comprised of a thick and nearly transparent membrane. Now, we haven't found a long-tailed pterosaur that large yet, so maybe they were exaggerating, or maybe there's one we haven't discovered yet. Okay, everybody say goodbye to Draco. Now, even evolutionists see a lot of the similarities between extinct reptiles and dragon legends. This book by Adrienne Mayer was published in 2023, where she says, many of the giants and monsters of myth did have a basis in fact, the enormous bones of long extinct species. So she tells a whole story about how ancient people near Mongolia, they must have seen some dinosaur bones that got uncovered and then made up legends of the griffin. That same year, though, a researcher came out with this paper, and they were unconvinced. They did a good job discrediting the ideas. They said, interpretations of ancient literary references to griffins as pertaining to Protoceratops are unconvincing, and suggested anatomical similarities between griffins and Protoceratops are selectively identified. So I think you guys should decide for yourself. So let's look at some of the ancient artwork of griffins, okay, from a few different cultures here. And which one of these lines up the best? The Protoceratops bones. This is a 4-legged hoofed animal with no wings, a big thick tail, or something more like a pterosaur that had 4 legs, sharp claws, beak, crest, a tail, large wings folded against the shoulder. Maybe griffin legends started with the pterosaur. All right, so we've talked about a few of our dragon legends so far. We've only got a little bit of time left. So let's quickly highlight a few more. This dragon is based on Baryonyx. Baryonyx was a 33-foot-long dinosaur with huge claws, long jaws, sharp teeth. Baryonyx also had a long muscular tail. Now here's an interesting thing. The Aberdeen Bestiary from 1500 AD talks about all sorts of animals, including dragons. Again, dragons along with real animals. And it says, they say it does not need poison to kill things because it kills anything around which it wraps its tail. Now, Leonardo da Vinci was a master at anatomy. He drew all kinds of animals. And in one of his drawings, he drew this animal, which looks a lot like a Baryonyx, a lot like a dragon. And you can see it has a coiled tail. So it lines up with some of these other accounts. Now, we see this in some living animals today, constrictors like boas and pythons, as well as some lizards, which have a prehensile tail that they can use to grasp things. We also see this behavior in some medieval paintings of George and the Dragon, where you can kind of see the dragon's tail there is wrapping around the horse's leg. So this is an example of a behavior that nobody would know from fossil bones, just finding a skeleton. This is a behavior that somebody observed. What about this fire-breathing business? Talking about behaviors. I mean, that sounds pretty fantastical, right? I mean, animals breathing fire? Well, many animals have behaviors that sound pretty outlandish if you've never seen them before. For example, spitting poison. That's not something you could tell from the fossil, and that sounds pretty crazy. Constricting, we just mentioned that one, right? An animal killing its prey by squeezing them. Electrocution. This one's nuts. If I didn't know about this and you told me that an animal can kill its prey by electrocuting them and not killing itself, I would have said you're crazy. But an electric eel does exactly that. This one is crazy, and recent research has shown that birds have a quantum compass built into their eyes so that they can see north, south, east, and west. Heat vision. Pit vipers can actually see heat. Even in your backyard, you might have experienced something like this, the spray of a skunk, right? Not something that you could tell from the bones or from the fossil. And then my favorite one is the bombardier beetle. This little beetle mixes two chemicals in its abdomen to create an incredibly hot spray that it sprays onto its enemies to protect itself. So maybe fire breathing isn't quite as crazy as it sounds. All right, 3 dragons down. Let's keep going. This dragon is Kentrosaurus. Look at the giant spines on the back of that dragon. Very dragon-like. Another medieval bestiary from around 1200 AD says this: the dragon's strength is found in its tail, not in its teeth. Its lashing tail does great harm. I would say that would do that. Yep. Would not want to be on the other end of that tail. And then Pliny the Elder was a prominent Roman author, naturalist, military commander from AD 77. And he said, Africa produces the elephants, but it is India that produces the largest as well as the dragon. So he's talking about elephants and dragons in the same sentence. Now, at that time, Greater India, the time of Pliny, was a much larger area, including the Tháp Ram Temple in Cambodia. And look at what's engraved in the Tháp Ram Temple alongside some other real animals. That looks a lot like a dinosaur, doesn't it? Anybody know which dinosaur? Happens to be my favorite dinosaur, Stegosaurus, which is about 21 feet long, had tail spikes up to 3 feet long. Looks like some people may have actually seen this animal and carved it into their temple. All right, only 2 left, and these are big ones. This dragon is based on Amargasaurus. It had huge neck spines coming off his neck. They recently found that other sauropods as well, like Diplodocus, this big guy, had spines on their neck as well, and back and tail, and these spines are up to 7 inches long. They also found that sauropods have all different types of scales on them. So this whole idea of like really smooth sauropods might not be very accurate. They may have been way more dragon-like than we realize, probably a lot more like reptiles we see today. And we do find evidence of sauropods living with people. Look at this drawing from Mauritania, West Africa. It's described as a painting of a mythical animal near the cave closely resembling a dinosaur with 2 mounted horses on the left. I'm not sure what else that could be other than a dinosaur. Another example, Bishop Richard Bell died in 1496, and as was the custom at the time, they buried him under the floor of the church in Carlisle, England. And etched on his grave were numerous real animals, along with a dragon, and these look like 2 sauropods with their necks intertwined. It's a little bit hard to see here, but I can't think of what else it would be. Now, the best evidence of dinosaurs living with people is the Bible, because its author has always been here and he knows everything. In Job 40, starting in verse 15, it says, "Look now at the behemoth, which I made along with you. He eats grass like an ox. See now, his strength is in his hips, and his power is in his stomach muscles. He moves his tail like a cedar tree. The sinews of his thighs are tightly knit." So he moves his tail like a cedar tree. When I was a kid, I remember reading this in my Bible, and I looked at the footnote, and it said that this animal might be a hippo or an elephant. The tail like a cedar tree. That's a cedar tree. And back in that day, in that part of the world, they got even bigger. I don't think that fits. That description is not a very good description. Now let's compare this to the largest sauropod we've ever found. This is Titanosaurus. Look at the size of that tail, and look at the size of that thigh bone. This thing is huge. Giant animal. A creature like this makes way more sense with the biblical account than something like a hippo or an elephant. Another account is found in the very next chapter of Job, Job 41, where it says, "Can you draw out Leviathan with a fishhook, or press down his tongue with a cord? Can you put a rope in his nose, or pierce his jaw with a hook? Out of his mouth go flaming torches. Sparks of fire leap forth. Out of his nostrils comes forth smoke, as from a boiling pot and burning rushes. His breath kindles coals, and a flame comes forth from his mouth." Again, that fire-breathing thing again, right? That was a Mosasaurus, up to 50 feet long. And the show Prehistoric Planet, they commissioned some scientific research to try to figure out how fast could a Mosasaurus swim. According to the research they did, it could swim 30 miles an hour in short bursts. That means it could cover 75% of its body length in 1 second. It's like being hit by a semi-truck. Verse 25 says, "When he raises himself up, the mighty are afraid. Because of his crashings, they are beside themselves." Many of you are probably familiar with the account of Job in the Bible. He had a horrible trial happen in his life. He lost much of what he owned. His children were killed. His wife told him to curse God and die. And he responds like I probably would. He questioned God. He asked, "Why, God?" And let's read how God answers Job. In Job 41, it says, "Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, 'Who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Now prepare yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determines its measurements? Surely you know.'" God basically says, "You think you know so much, don't you, Job?" And we do, don't we? We're arrogant that way. We think we know a lot. But God questioned him. So instead of answering Job's question, God spends 4 chapters proclaiming his works to Job and asking Job questions. And at the end of that, God ends on these 2 enormous creatures we just talked about, Behemoth and Leviathan. And at the end of talking about Behemoth, God says, "He is the first of the ways of God. Only he who made him can bring near his sword." And when he finishes talking about Leviathan, he says, "On earth there is not his like, a creature without fear. He sees everything that is high. He is king over all the sons of pride." Try to put yourself in Job's shoes, right? He's facing this really difficult trial, and he questions God like many of us would. But God lays him low. God humbles him. And after that, Job replies, completely humbled. It says, "Then Job answered the Lord and said, 'I know that you can do everything, and that no purpose of yours can be withheld from you. You asked, who is this who hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me which I did not know. Listen, please, and let me speak. You said, I will question you, and you shall answer me. I have heard you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore I abhor myself and repent in dust and ashes.'" I want to encourage you guys to read God's word and allow it to humble you like it did Job. God's word is unmatched. God knows everything. We know so little, but God knows everything. We can trust him. We can trust his word. We can trust the history in the Bible. And because we can trust God's word, we can trust the history in the Bible. We can trust the gospel that's rooted in that history. And we can put our trust in him for salvation of our sins. So like I said, We've only scratched the surface on dragon legends. There are so many more that we could talk about. There are hundreds of dragon legends like these. Legends are rooted in reality, and when you view the world through a biblical lens, it makes so much more sense.